So that's the title of the citation, and Gateway is the seller. Okay, so you have your facts, and remember I told you should always put the facts in after you do the issue. Okay, now, I'll teach you another little saying we have in America. Okay, so you get the concept? If I had had more time, I would have written less. It's hard to write less. It's easy to just go blah, 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 just write everything on your mind, right? Organizing what you're writing and being concise is hard, okay? So, one of the ways we can see that Judge Easterbrook took a lot of time to compose this opinion. So he knew that this was going to be an important opinion, and that if he wrote it very clearly and in a very persuasive way, then he would succeed. Because he only has the ability to change the law through persuasiveness. The only states that are required to follow his rule, oh, no, on the internet. Shoot. Okay. So if you look up the circuit map, the circuit for the 7th Circuit, it's Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, like that. So it's in the center of the United States. Those are the only people that are mandated to follow him. All the other judges that follow Judge Easterbrook, it's 100% voluntary. Okay? So the issue I mentioned to you is the 3rd sentence. Okay? Are the terms of the market fenced in? Yeah. Okay, so the holding is, right? Of course they're effective. Okay, are the terms of the box binding? Okay. So, what are the facts that get us there? Okay, so the Hills got some marketing materials. This was the very beginning of the internet. The internet was not yet very established, and so if they got marketing materials, it could have been a paper catalog. Okay, so they got marketing materials, they telephone, and in America it's an 800 number. It's toll free, it's a free number, you call, there's no charge to the caller. Telephone 800 number, spoke to sales rep, ordered, computer, and paid by credit card. So those are the facts, and the most interesting part of this case is the rationale, because he gives a law and economics rationale for what he's doing. In those 2 paragraphs that I told you, it says for their second Sally, and now the Hills insist, for those 2 paragraphs, that's where U.S. law professors would say his technical summary of American law is inaccurate, it's wrong. Okay, so we don't need to go into that. You can just take my word for it that a lot of people think it's really shocking what he wrote in those paragraphs, that he mischaracterized American law. Okay, but the part where he's really clear, he's super clear about explaining the facts, he's super clear about explaining the holding, and what else is he super clear about? He's super clear about giving the rationale. It's like, let me explain to you why this case needs to go this way. Okay, so let's look through here. So it says, I'm looking at the bottom of, it's like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's the 5th paragraph. It says, plaintiffs ask us to limit pro-CD to software. But where's the sense in that? Pro-CD is about the law of contract, not the law of software. Payment preceding the revelation of full terms is common for air transportation, insurance, and many other endeavors. Practical considerations support allowing vendors to enclose the full legal terms with their products. Okay? So, all consumers, now here it is. Okay, so if you skip down here, it says, the writing provides benefits for both sides of the commercial transaction. Consumers as a group are better off when vendors skip costly and ineffectual steps, such as telephone recitation, and use a simple approve or return device. That's the rationale. He says, Mr. and Mrs. Hill might feel unhappy, but American consumers generally will like my decision. Okay? It's a harsh decision, but most Americans will support it. So remember, what did I tell you yesterday? American consumers think consumer protection law is a tax on smart consumers for dumb ones. And they look at this and they say, I had a textbook once that had this case, was the first case in the casebook, and all of my students found it completely persuasive, and they said, Mr. and Mrs. Hill were dumb and they deserve to lose. Completely brainwashed. Okay, so the rationale is consumers as a group are better off when vendors skip costly and ineffectual and use simple approve or return. Okay, so that's his main rationale. Okay? Does everybody get that? I'm going to say that. Okay, so I'll put that up on the website afterwards. Okay, so everybody see that? So this case is like a huge fundamental reform in American contract law. It's going 180 degrees the opposite to European contract law. Okay? And it's a UCC Article 2 sale of goods case. That's why it's in commercial law. Okay, so what's the next case? Now, the next case I'm not going to read through quite so carefully. Let me go ahead and explain to you what the next case is about. The next case is about unconscionability. Okay, so in America we don't have unfair contract terms because Americans do not want European socialism. So they would say unfair contract terms law is European socialism. We reject European socialism. Okay, now the concept of unconscionability, it's kind of a remote, distant cousin of lésion, right, in French contract law. So lésion is like a traditional idea in the French Civil Code. It's very limited in scope. So unconscionability is a traditional idea. It's relatively limited in scope. But when Carl Llewellyn wrote UCC Article 2 in the 1950s, he completely redefined it, and he made it much, much broader. Okay? So he said, when he went around to the state bar associations, and they say, what's this unconscionability stuff? And he said, it's just a restatement. It's just a codification. But in fact, he expanded it a lot. Okay? So, what is it? So if you look at UCC 2302, it doesn't define unconscionability. It just says that if something is unconscionable, then the judge can refuse to enforce that one term, like they can take out the arbitration term and refuse to enforce it, or they can strike down the entire contract. That rule is the same as unfair contract terms. In unfair contract terms, if you find an unfair contract term, you can remove the one term and leave all the other terms, or you can strike down the whole contract. Now, in the United States, we feel worried that judges would think a lot of business practice is unconscionable. So he wrote into the UCC that juries may not make this decision. Only judges may make this decision, and then they have to tell the juries, because juries would be too sympathetic to consumers. Okay, So the case law that we're going to read, which is the Williams versus Walker Thomas furniture case, created two branches. One is procedural unconscionability, where it's impossible for the consumer to learn the terms before they agree. And the other one is substantive unconscionability, which is that the terms are shockingly unfair. Okay, so the American case law, not the UCC section 2302, make that decision between procedural and substantive. Okay, now, a contract of adhesion, quote unquote contract of adhesion, that's what the subject is of the Unfair Contract Terms Directive. Now, just because you have a contract of adhesion, if the drafter of the contract, the merchant, doesn't create an unfair imbalance and doesn't have an unreasonable profit at the consumer's expense, just because it's a contract of adhesion doesn't make it unenforceable. So for example, this evening I'm flying to Milan on the Air France has a second airline called HOP, right? So I click through and I pay by my credit card. That's a contract of adhesion. I can't individually negotiate with HOP. But if the contract is fair, then it doesn't violate unfair contract terms. So contract of adhesion by itself cannot be procedurally unconscionable. We feel a little bit worried if it's a contract of adhesion, and we might study the contract terms more carefully, but by itself, that can't be unconscionable. Now here's a problem, which is I couldn't get the graphic to work, because really what you want is you want this to be like white and that to be blue, but I couldn't get the thing to turn sideways in PowerPoint, so that's just a problem with PowerPoint. Okay, so in American contract law, Mr. and Mrs. Hill made a really bad deal. It's completely enforceable. Okay, I'll teach you a okay. Okay. So remember I told you I was an au pair like a long time ago, before you were all born. I was an au pair. Okay, let me teach this again. Okay, so let me tell you, there's something that French parents say to their children, which American parents don't exactly say. Okay, so you know how French parents say "veux-tu te taire," right? Okay, so Americans say "shut up and stop whining." It's the same meaning. Okay, so just so you know. So, what did Judge Easterbrook say to Mr. and Mrs. Hill? He said, "Shut up and stop whining. You made a choice. Now you have to live with it." Right? Okay, that's really bad deal. So, my contract with HOP is a contract of adhesion. It's completely enforceable. There's no problem with the terms. It's a normal airline contract, right? Now, really bad deals in both French and American law are routinely enforced. You don't have to enter into a contract. Contract is a duty freely chosen. If you freely choose a bad contract, then, you have to live with consequences. So, unfair contract terms is an exception to the general rule that you choose your contracts and you have to live with them. Okay? Now, so substantive unconscionability is about the terms, procedural unconscionability. Now, if a term is like shockingly unfair, and it's just a contract of adhesion, you just click through, then we could apply unconscionability. If it's impossible for the consumers to learn what the terms are, and the terms are just a little bit unfair, then it could still be unconscionable. So you see, it isn't mandatory to have two. If you have really bad on one angle or the other, then the other one can be just a little bit bad. Does that make sense? It's called sliding scale. Okay, so what else we got? Okay, so we can compare this. So lots of countries around the world have unfair contract terms. So the European model is becoming very popular. Okay, so let's look at the second case, and then we'll look at the Williams versus Walker Thomas furniture case. Okay, so the next case is Tony Brower versus Gateway 2000. Now, have you learned that in the United States, because litigation, or what did Alexis de Tocqueville say? Sooner or later, in the United States, political questions are all turned into judicial questions, right? So, because judicial questions can be political, we have a custom called amicus curiae brief. You know that? Amicus curiae brief? Okay, so, say there's a lawsuit involving something in the city of Seattle, in downtown Seattle. And I live in Seattle, and it's going to affect my quality of life. I can go to the courthouse and I can say, here's my brief. I'm not a party, but I want to complain because I don't want the defendant to win. And the court has discretion. They can receive my brief. It's called an amicus curiae brief, right in the court. I'm not a party to the litigation, but I can submit a brief. Okay? So, in the first Hill versus Gateway case, let me tell you, there were like 20 amicus curiae briefs. All the consumer groups submitted briefs, all the business groups submitted briefs. So it was a huge victory for business, a huge defeat for consumer groups. So consumer groups went away and they did a lot of research and they got much smarter. So the second time there was a big lawsuit involving Gateway, the consumers submitted much better amicus curiae briefs. They did a lot more research, okay? That's why the Brower case has a different result. So the consumers got organized, they did some more research, and they point out, they say, this is outrageous for a company located in the United States to say consumers have to arbitrate under International Chamber of Commerce rules. One of the International Chamber of Commerce rules at that time was you had to pay a $4,000 US deposit to begin the arbitration, and even if you won the arbitration, $2,000 was non-refundable. Mr. and Mrs. Hill only paid $1,500 for their computer. Right? Now, nobody pointed that out to Judge Easterbrook. They didn't raise that issue with Judge Easterbrook. In between, this case is decided just 1 year after Hill versus Gateway. So all the consumer groups did a lot of research, and they point out how shockingly unfair ICC arbitration, which is invented for like Total, is having a lawsuit with, you know, BP or something, you know, or Lever Brothers is having a lawsuit with, I don't know what, Carrefour, right? I mean, so the International Chamber of Commerce rules are for sophisticated multinational corporations. You can't apply them to consumers. So the consumer said, this is outrageous. So if you read the case, we don't have time to read it paragraph by paragraph because it's a little longer. But basically he says, the consumers have told me about how much they hate Judge Easterbrook's opinion. And let me tell you, I completely, totally agree with Judge Easterbrook's reasoning about consumers as a group benefit from a simple pay or return device. He said, I am completely persuaded by the reasoning in Judge Easterbrook's decision about the general concept of pay now, terms later. And he said, and they complain about, like, you know, contract of adhesion, they didn't make the arbitration clause prominent. It's like tough. That's the way things work. He said, so, every argument that you've raised to criticize the Gateway Computer Company, I find completely unpersuasive until we get to the impact of the arbitration term on American consumers. He said, so, I'm going to apply unconscionability law, which has two branches, substantive and procedural. And he says, it's simply substantively unconscionable that a merchant can sell a product and they can make it impossible for any consumer ever to complain. Now, in America we have a harsh system, but that's too harsh. Okay? So he said, if there's no possible way that any consumer can ever complain about their Gateway computer, that's unconscionable. So he said, okay, so I disagree with your arguments about contract formation, I agree with Judge Easterbrook, but Judge Easterbrook didn't understand the math. He didn't understand the expense of International Chamber of Commerce arbitration. I understand the expense, and it's shockingly unfair, and I refuse to enforce it. He said, but, he said, in the United States, we have a strong policy favoring arbitration. So he said, I will send this case back to the trial court, and I will let the trial court choose a different arbitrator and different rules. So they still have to arbitrate. They don't get their class action lawsuit. You see, this is almost not a victory for the consumers. He said the arbitration term the Gateway chose is too unfair. I can't enforce it. But we will let the trial court find a different way to organize the arbitration. So does everybody see? It's a very, very limited holding. Okay, so I guess, shall we go ahead, let's go ahead and like, try and brief this case. Yeah, okay, so if we try and brief the Hill versus Gateway case, the Brower versus Gateway. Okay. Now, the difference here is this is a judge in New York State. Yes, This is a judge in New York State. He's not a federal judge, and so he's an elected judge. So even as an elected judge, he's still ruling against the local New York State citizen. Okay, so what would the issue be here? Okay, so in this one it says plaintiffs commences action. Okay, so now if you read in the second full paragraph, it says plaintiffs commence this action on behalf of themselves and others similarly situated for compensatory and punitive damages. So they wanted punitive damages. They're alleging deceptive sales practices. They have seven different claims: breach of warranty, breach of contract, fraud, and unfair trade practices. They left out the RICO stuff because that was like totally stupid. Okay. In particular, they say that you'll receive around-the-clock service and it's a lie. Okay. So they can do computers. Okay. They dismiss the complaint. We agree. Okay. So with respect to something. Okay. So I'm moving towards the end of the case. Okay, so what do we want to say? So the issue is, are buyers now I'm going to call it pay now turns later, but Easterbrook called it an accept or return, right? Okay, so okay, so I'm looking, there's a paragraph towards the end. It says, with regard to the substantive element, which entails an examination of the substance of the agreement in order to determine whether the terms are unreasonably favor one party, we do not find the possible inconvenience of the chosen site, Chicago, alone raises to the level of unconscionability. That's okay. In the United States, you can force New York State consumers to travel all the way to Chicago to have an arbitration. That's not a problem. He says, we do find, however, that the excessive cost factor that is necessarily entailed in arbitrating under the ICC rules, he said before the ICC, but it's under the ICC rules, is unreasonable and surely serves to deter individual consumers from invoking the process. So, they are barred from resorting to the courts. Consumers are thus left with no forum at all, which leaves consumers with no forum at all. Right? Okay. So, what does he say? So he actually says, we can actually just copy it from the other one. We can say, the rationale is consumers as a group are better off, right? He agrees with that. He says, I agree with Judge Easterbrook. Okay, so he's saying it's not good for a society, it's not economically efficient if a merchant can completely prevent anyone from ever complaining about what they did. Right? So he says, okay, that's ridiculous, that's inefficient. So we should do that. Okay, so are there any questions? Oh, facts, we didn't do facts. Okay, so it's the same as the other one. What are the facts? So, purchase. Now, did you purchase it by telephone or online? I think you might have purchased it online. Okay, direct sales, telephone or mail order. Okay, so yeah, send purchase computer. Okay, now they changed it. Oh, so this is full 30 days. Okay, so they kept computer. Okay, so basically it's the same fact pattern as Hill versus Gately, basically. Okay? Okay, so everybody's okay with that? There's your case for you. Okay, so the next one we need to do is we need to do Williams versus Walker Thomas Furniture, because we don't have that much time left. So if we finish Williams versus Walker Thomas Furniture, if you look at the table of contents for the course says that today we should be starting Article 2 back at noon, like 1.5 hours ago. And then we would also do payments. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to tell you number 8. Number 8 says Articles 5 and 8, just delete that. We just took that out of the syllabus. So the reading for Article 8 you don't need to do. Okay? Because to keep on schedule so that we finish on time. Okay? So next Monday, what are we going to do on Monday? Next Monday, we're going to do Articles 3, 4, and 4A, and you have the Evra versus Swiss Bank case and the introduction to Article 4A. And then the second thing we're going to do on Monday is you have a short article about internet computer crime stealing money from business bank accounts. So that's a U.S. commercial law question. Okay? So what we're going to do on Monday is electronic fund transfers. Is a kind of American commercial law. Okay? So we'll finish up sales law today, and then we'll do the, okay, so the Williams versus Walker Thomas Furniture. Okay, so this is a very, very, very famous case. I didn't put the citation. 350 Okay, so who are the parties? Williams, the buyer, under Thomas Furniture, the seller. Okay, so now there's a trade practice regulation that you have in countries like Germany and France that we do not have in America, which is when you stand outside a shop and you're looking inside the shop into the display case, they have to display the prices, right? That's a really, really, really basic trade practices regulation. Like you go into a cafe and they have a list of the different drinks, and you go into a bakery and they have a list of the different things. Okay, so the first thing to understand about Walker Thomas Furniture is they didn't follow that rule because in America we don't have that rule. So Walker Thomas Furniture was a furniture store that was in a poor, predominantly African American neighborhood. And their business model was to sell furniture on credit to African Americans who didn't own cars. Now, the wealthy people who lived in this area, they lived in the suburbs and they had cars. So they could go to shopping malls. In the 1960s, there were already shopping malls in America. So the people with lots of money could go to modern stores and they could actually buy things cheap. But when you went into the inner city where people didn't have cars and they couldn't choose between a lot of different merchants, where they really had to work with the local merchant, the prices were much higher. And it's even worse than that. The prices were not marked. And the salesperson would get a bonus if they could convince the buyer to pay more. Okay, so they would try and figure out how much money the buyer had, and then they would put up the price until it matched the amount of money that the buyer had. Okay? So what do you call that? That is like a fraudulent and deceptive trade practice. I mean, these are very, very predatory trade practices. Okay? Now, the other thing, okay, so first of all, it was an inner city merchant preying on local residents. Okay, now, this fact pattern used to be very, very common, and it's not common much anymore because of the modernization of the American retail sector. So in these inner city neighborhoods in the United States now, there's stores like Carrefour. You know, there's the Grand Surface stores, right? So these old merchants have all been put out of business. This doesn't exist anymore, but this is 50 years ago, and it was a huge problem for the people that lived in that neighborhood. Now, Mrs. Williams lives on public assistance with 7 children. Okay, so she has no visible means of employment except she lives on government assistance, and she has 7 children. So she's trying to raise her 7 children with very, very, very small amount of money. And the way that these merchants is that customers pay weekly. So every week she would get her public assistance payment, and one of the things she would do when she bought groceries is she would also stop by the Walker Thomas Furniture Company and she would make cash payment on her account. And so she would pay and pay and pay. So all of the furniture in her apartment was from this Walker Thomas Furniture Company. And they had a cross-collateralization. Okay, so do you remember on the first day I showed you that really weird video about Repo Man? So one of the rules in the United States is if you lend money to a consumer and you take goods as collateral, the Walker Thomas Furniture Company had the right to enter her apartment and take all the furniture back. And then her children will be sleeping on the floor. Okay? So, in order to make that more interesting, they had a term in their contract which said, every single piece of furniture you have ever bought from the Walker Thomas Furniture remains collateral for your current debt. So, she had almost paid her account down to zero, and then they sold her a phonograph record player. So this is the 1960s, you know, phonograph long records, right? It's like a big thing, okay? She paid $500 for a phonograph record player. Let me tell you, the rich people out in the suburbs were buying that same phonograph record player for $200. Okay? So not only is it completely inappropriate to sell to somebody who's struggling to feed and clothe 7 children a phonograph record player, it's completely unethical to sell it for like 3 times the price. Okay? So, she had almost paid for all of her furniture. She would have been free of the Walker Thomas Furniture Company, but she goes to visit them every week to make the cash payment. And they said, Mrs. Williams, everyone has a phonograph record player. You and your children need a phonograph record player. And they convinced her to buy a phonograph record player. Okay? So now her debt has gone back up to $500, and she's going to be paying for like another 5 years. And if she misses a payment, they can take all the beds, they can take the table and the chairs, they can take the refrigerator, everything, because she didn't pay for the phonograph. Okay? Now, the entire complete transaction at all times would be completely illegal under French law. Right? Does everybody see this? This is like shockingly, shockingly unfair contract. Okay? So, what did the lower court say? The lower court said, we are shocked. We are shocked by the misbehavior of the Walker Thomas Furniture Company, and we hope that the local government will step in to pass some consumer protection laws. That's what the first court said. Now, there's another problem in the background that you wouldn't know. Mrs. Williams lived in Washington, D.C. And one of the problems the American city of Washington, D.C. has is it's our nation's capital. It doesn't have a separate city government the way other cities do. Legislation in Washington, D.C. comes from U.S. Congress. So all the Senate and all the House of Representatives have to agree that Washington, D.C. needs a new consumer protection law. Do you understand the problem? You need the entire American national legislation system to authorize a consumer law reform in little Washington, D.C. Okay? So, the second judge that heard this on the Court of Appeals is named Skelly Wright. So, Skelly Wright is an interesting person. Okay, so I mentioned to you one of the most famous judicial activism cases in the United States is Brown versus Board of Education. That was the United States Supreme Court case that started desegregation. Now, the local judges in states that had segregation in the South would not enforce that decision because they were local elected judges. They believed in segregation. They didn't think it was a bad idea. The only judges that would enforce desegregation were U.S. federal judges appointed by the president and approved by the Senate who have lifetime tenure. They can stay in their job until they die. So, for the first 20 years after Brown versus Board of Education, all enforcement of desegregation in the United States happened either with the United States National Guard, which is the domestic federal government army, or it went through the federal courts. Skelly Wright used to be a federal judge in Louisiana. He got promoted to being on the Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. The reason he got promoted from Louisiana to Washington, D.C. is because he had enforced desegregation in Louisiana. And it was very politically controversial. Some of the federal judges received death threats. There were people that came in with guns into federal courthouses trying to kill federal judges. So, Skelly Wright was a very courageous person. And then, it's like he won the lottery. It's like you go to Paris, right? It's like, oh, he got promoted to live in Washington, D.C. So he was pretty happy, right? He got a big promotion, got to live in our nation's capital. And then he had this case. For Judge Skelly Wright, this was easy. To be courageous in this case is much easier than what he had been doing before. So he just said, this merchant is engaged in unconscionable behavior. And so I'm going to say that this cross-collateral term is unenforceable. So, the question is, issue. Okay, so he just held, this is outrageous. Now, after he decided that in this decision, U.S. Congress passed a law prohibiting it. And the Federal Trade Commission, the United States Trade Practices Authority, began prohibiting it. Okay? So his decision was the first, and it was followed by legislation later. Now, so at the beginning of class on Monday, we'll go ahead and we'll look at the Williams versus Walker Thomas furniture case. The final thing, so this is a famous, famous case. And you'll notice there's a judge, Judge Danaher. Judge Danaher says, this is ridiculous. Judge Skelly Wright doesn't have permission to do this. Judge Skelly Wright can't reform the contract law of the District of Columbia. He doesn't have permission, right? Danaher is like Judge Easterbrook. Get it? So the dissent thinks Skelly Wright is wrong and he doesn't have permission to do this. It's an impermissible use of his authority. Okay? So this case is very, very famous. So this case is widely followed, just like Judge Easterbrook's case is widely followed. This case is the case where they introduced the concept of substantive and procedurally unconscionable. Skelly Wright created those two concepts, and the judicial decisions later all followed. Okay? So I'll go ahead and save that PowerPoint and put it up so you have those case proofs. Okay? So it's about, I think it's about time to finish, isn't it? Yeah? Okay. Just see you on Monday. Work is that customers pay weekly. So every week she would get her public assistance payment, and one of the things she would do when she bought groceries is she would also stop by the Walker Thomas Furniture Company and she would make cash payment on her account. And so she would pay and pay and pay. So all of the furniture in her apartment was from this Walker Thomas Furniture Company. And they had a cross-collateralization. Okay, so do you remember on the first day I showed you that really weird video about Repo Man? So one of the rules in the United States is if you lend money to a consumer and you take goods as collateral, the Walker Thomas Furniture Company had the right to enter her apartment and take all the furniture back. And then her children will be sleeping on the floor. Okay? So, in order to make that more interesting, they had a term in their contract which said, every single piece of furniture you have ever bought from the Walker Thomas Furniture remains collateral for your current debt. So, she had almost paid her account down to zero, and then they sold her a phonograph record player. So this is the 1960s, you know, phonograph long records, right? It's like a big thing, okay? She paid $500 for a phonograph record player. Let me tell you, the rich people out in the suburbs were buying that same phonograph record player for $200. Okay? So not only is it completely inappropriate to sell to somebody who's struggling to feed and clothe 7 children a phonograph record player, it's completely unethical to sell it for like 3 times the price. Okay? So, she had almost paid for all of her furniture. She would have been free of the Walker Thomas Furniture Company, but she goes to visit them every week to make the cash payment. And they said, Mrs. Williams, Everyone has a phonograph record player. You and your children need a phonograph record player. And they convinced her to buy a phonograph record player. Okay? So now her debt has gone back up to $500 and she's going to be paying for like another 5 years. And if she misses a payment, they can take all the beds, they can take the table and the chairs, they can take the refrigerator, everything, because she didn't pay for the phonograph. Okay? Now, the entire complete transaction at all times would be completely illegal under French law. Right? Does everybody see this? This is like shockingly, shockingly unfair contract. Okay? So, what did the lower court say? The lower court said, we are shocked. We are shocked by the misbehavior of the Walker Thomas Furniture Company. And we hope that the local government will step in to pass some consumer protection laws. That's what the first court said. Now, there's another problem in the background that you wouldn't know. Mrs. Williams lived in Washington, D.C. And one of the problems the American city of Washington, D.C. has is it's our nation's capital. It doesn't have a separate city government the way other cities do. Legislation in Washington, D.C. comes from U.S. Congress. So all the Senate and all the House of Representatives have to agree that Washington, D.C. needs a new consumer protection law. Do you understand the problem? You need the entire American national legislation system to authorize a consumer law reform in little Washington, D.C. Okay? So, the second judge that heard this on the Court of Appeals is named Skelly Wright. So, Skelly Wright is an interesting person. Okay, so I mentioned to you one of the most famous judicial activism cases in the United States is Brown versus Board of Education. That was the United States Supreme Court case that started desegregation. Now, the local judges in states that had segregation in the South would not enforce that decision because they were local elected judges. They believed in segregation. They didn't think it was a bad idea. The only judges that would enforce desegregation were U.S. federal judges, appointed by the president and approved by the Senate, who have lifetime tenure. They can stay in their job until they die. So, for the first 20 years after Brown versus Board of Education, all enforcement of desegregation in the United States happened either with the United States National Guard, which is the domestic federal government army, or it went through the federal courts. Skelly Wright used to be a federal judge in Louisiana. He got promoted to being on the Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C. The reason he got promoted from Louisiana to Washington, D.C. is because he had enforced desegregation in Louisiana. And it was very politically controversial. Some of the federal judges received death threats. There were people that came in with guns into federal courthouses trying to kill federal judges. So, Skelly Wright was a very courageous person. And then, it's like he won the lottery. It's like you go to Paris, right? It's like, oh, he got promoted to live in Washington, D.C. So he was pretty happy, right? He got a big promotion, got to live in our nation's capital. And then he had this case. For Judge Skelly Wright, this was easy. To be courageous in this case is much easier than what he had been doing before. So he just said, this merchant is engaged in unconscionable behavior. And so I'm going to say that this cross-collateral term is unenforceable. So, the question is, issue. Okay, so he just held, this is outrageous. Now, after he decided that in this decision, U.S. Congress passed a law prohibiting it. And the Federal Trade Commission, the United States Trade Practices Authority, began prohibiting it. Okay? So his decision was the first, and it was followed by legislation later. Now, so at the beginning of class on Monday, we'll go ahead and we'll look at the Williams versus Walker Thomas Furniture case. The final thing, so this is a famous, famous case. And you'll notice there's a judge, Judge Danaher. Judge Danaher says, this is ridiculous. Judge Skelly Wright doesn't have permission to do this. Judge Skelly Wright can't reform the contract law of the District of Columbia. He doesn't have permission, right? Anaher is like Judge Easterbrook. Get it? So the dissent thinks Skelly Wright is wrong and he doesn't have permission to do this. It's an impermissible use of his authority. Okay? So this case is very, very famous. So this case is widely followed, just like Judge Easterbrook's case is widely followed. This case is the case where they introduced the concept of substantive and procedurally unconscionable. Skelly Wright created those two concepts, and the judicial decisions later all followed. Okay? So I'll go ahead and save that PowerPoint and put it up so you have those case proofs. Okay? So it's about, I think it's about time to finish, isn't it? Yeah? Okay. Just see you on Monday.